Right, welcome second year to your S2 Slavery Revision, this time for inquiry skills. Inquiry skills are a little bit more awkward to study for, I suppose, than your knowledge and understanding, because your knowledge and understanding you can trying to remember facts and figures, whereas inquiry skills is more about how you actually answer questions. So we're going to look at a couple of different types. Okay, how useful is a source? This is asking you to comment on 4 areas. First of all, who wrote it? Was the person there at the time? If so, they're an eyewitness. Is the person a historian who's writing a long time after the event? If so, he's an expert. When was it written? Was the source written at the time? If it was, it's a primary source. If it was written a good bit of time after the event, then it's a secondary source. What does the source actually say? So for instance, if you're investigating conditions on board slave ships, and it says how useful is the source for investigating conditions on slave ships, you want to talk about the source says that conditions on slave ships were bad because, for instance, they were kept in chains, something like that. And then lastly, you want to say, is it biased or does it miss anything out? In other words, is it only given one side of the story, or is there some vital, important detail that the source doesn't tell you about? So here's an example. Source A, written by a slave in 1787. How useful is source A as evidence for conditions on slave ships? So there's 4 marks, so we want to talk about 4 things. Your answer would include, and obviously you would do it in paragraph form, I'm just doing it in bullet point form at the moment. The source is useful because it's written by an eyewitness who was there at the time. Okay, so it's a slave in 1787, so that's when the slavery was going on, and because he was there at the time, he's an eyewitness. Okay. Is also useful because it's a primary source as it was written in 1787. It was written at the time, therefore it's a primary source. You need to put these bits in, by the way. It was an eyewitness who was there at the time. You can't just say he's an eyewitness. And then you need to put, is a primary source, or it's a primary source because it was written in 1787. You can't just say primary source. The source describes that conditions were terrible as slaves were kept in chains. So there we're commenting on what it actually talks about according to the question. Source A as evidence for conditions on slave ships, and it tells that they're terrible. An example, they were kept in chains. And then this is a bias that missed anything out. However, the source is biased as it only gives the side of the slaves and not of the crew. So there's also crew on the ship, whereas this is just written by a slave, so it's only from their point of view. Okay. Next up, I'm just going to use the same source just for ease, but the question's changed. What evidence is there that conditions on board slave ships were bad? In this sort of question, you're just looking to take bits of information out. For example, it's 3 marks, okay, so you need 3 pieces of information. You would say the evidence that conditions on board slaves were bad is that it is described as a horrible scene. Groans and cries of slaves, and that they were whipped and beaten. So for each of these you would put in a little sentence. You would say the evidence that the conditions were bad as the slave describes it, or the source describes it as a horrible scene. The source also describes the groans and the cries of slaves and how they were whipped and beaten. That's you getting your 3 marks. And this is the last type of question that we're going to go over. It's what you call a comparison question, because you're comparing this source with this one. This one's written by a slave. It's the same one as what we've been using, so it talks about how bad they were treated on board the ships. And this one's written by a slave owner, and it talks about how they were not treated too badly, or paints a picture that shows they weren't actually treated too badly on the slave plantations. So how far the sources B and C disagree about the treatment of slaves? 3 marks, so you're looking for 3 comparisons. First one, source A says that slaves were kept in chains, talks about the rattling of chains there, but source B says they were given rum at night. Okay, so they disagree a little bit. One's telling them that they're always chained up, and the other one's talking about how they get a wee bit of alcohol to enjoy their evening. Source A talks about slaves groaning and crying, whereas source B talks about slaves being given musical instruments. Okay, so they're groaning and crying here, yet they're allowed musical instruments. So they disagree on how they were treated. And lastly, source A says that slaves were beaten, but source B says they were given feasts of meat. So they were whipped and beaten, and they're given feast of meat. So that's, again, obviously disagreeing in how they were treated. So that's how you'd answer that question. The best thing to do is make sure you always read the question, make sure you understand the question, make sure you read and understand the sources, and then check how many marks there are for each question. If there's 3 in a comparison, you're going to make 3 comparisons. If it's as what evidence is there, you're going to have 3 pieces of evidence from the source. And if it's a how useful, you're going to talk about the 4 points that we said: who wrote it, when it was written, what it says, and any bias or limitation. Okay, so good luck with your test tomorrow, and I'll see you then.